Arrow functions are the new, cooler way to create functions, and you should use them all of the time everywhere, right? Wrong. Actually, really wrong. It is true that they're a little cooler, a little shorter to write than regular functions, but it's way more complicated than that. In this video, I'll show you how to write arrow functions, so syntax, but more importantly, when to use them and when absolutely not to use them. This is a 10-part series I'm calling 10 things JavaScript developers should know but probably don't. This is episode 7, arrow functions. Let's do it. You can turn almost any function into an arrow function. Almost. A quick overview of our function types. Anonymous functions, which have no name, which is why they're called anonymous. Usually a function expression that you assign to a variable, like this. Callback functions, which you pass into other functions as a parameter, which is actually an anonymous function expression too, like this. Then we have named functions like factory functions or constructor functions. They come with their own name in front of the word function, like that. We've talked a lot about these in this series. Here's a factory and here is a constructor. And then we have object methods, which are functions inside an object. We've also seen plenty of these in this series. And we have generator functions, which we're not interested in today. That's beyond the scope. So let's go through each of these function types and convert them into arrows. To the browser. Alrighty, let's start with anonymous functions. So const say hello to the rugs photography. If you know what song that is, I will personally send you a gift. Say hello function and returns hello. All right, I can just call it and say hello. So how do I convert this into an arrow function? I'm just gonna rewrite it, and instead of writing function, you get rid of the name and you type in an arrow between the parentheses and the curlies. I'm actually going to call this say hello to, and press enter and say hello to. That's it. If you're passing an argument to it, you can say hello. I can pass in name, and then let me change this return statement to actually include the name. So I can say hello name, right? Let's call this say hello 3 because it's going to yell at us. Say hello 3. Oh, I didn't pass a parameter. Sina. Done. If you're passing multiple, I'm going to refresh. I'm going to actually do this again, except I'm going to pass in multiple parameters. If you have, let's say, first name, and you have a last name. Okay, what if I had hello? Hello, it is incredibly difficult to type inside a browser. Somebody messaged me the other day and said, why can't I do this? First name, and then let's do last name. Okay, and then I can invoke the function and then pass in my multiple parameters. Sina Jazz in the house. Cool. So if you have multiple parameters, you just pass them in the same way. If you have one parameter, let me go back to that one. If I have just first name, you can get rid of the parentheses, which is nice, right? And that would be the exact same thing. I can call that, right? It works. And if your function is actually just a single return statement, you can get rid of the whole return and the curlies. How nice is that? And it's gonna yell at me, so I'm gonna refresh and do it again and say hello. Boom, beautiful, right? Oh, also arrow functions don't get arguments by default. So if I have a regular function, I'm gonna write this one more time, equals function. If I don't pass in any params, I can actually just do console log and write arguments, even though I didn't define arguments. I don't know what that is. So what is that? Well, if I call say hello and pass in Sina Jazz, let's see, that's my first name, last name, my age, 14. The console log actually, the arguments variable, I guess, is always available inside regular functions as an array of arguments that you pass in, even though I didn't define them up here, right? So I get an array of 0, 1, 2, 3, and that's cool. But the point I'm trying to make is that arrow functions do not. If I convert this and call it the same way, it says argument is not defined. So just remember that you can't do it. So that's it. Those are anonymous functions. Pretty simple. Second was callback functions. So callback functions, which are functions you pass as a parameter to another function, which is called a higher order function. I like to use set timeout as a higher order function, which will be actually the topic of the next video is higher order functions. So if I have set timeout, usually what you do is you just pass in a function, a callback function. So usually I'll just do this, right? And then I say after what, 1,000 milliseconds. So after 1 second, I want you to console.log, hello. And it doesn't, right? So pretty simple. So how can I convert this into an arrow function? I'll do the exact same thing as an anonymous function because this is an anonymous function. So let me do that and we'll wait 1 second and it goes boom, hello. Except there is a big gotcha with callback functions, which we'll get into during the what not to do with arrow functions, which it comes up in a couple of minutes. So moving on to named functions. These we don't assign to a variable. We just say function, say hello. That's a regular function. And I say console.log, say hello to the rugs topography. Seriously, if you know what song that is, awesome. You're cool. I was going to say dude, but whatever you are. Great. Say hello. Oops. Say hello. Perfect. Works. It console logs hello. So how do I convert this into an arrow function? Well, can I do exactly what I did before? Get rid of the word function and put an arrow between the parentheses and the curly? Let's see. Malformed arrow function parameter list, whatever. So you can't do that. And unfortunately, you cannot have a named arrow function. Arrow functions are always an anonymous function. So instead, what we can do is just assign it to a variable like we did with anonymous functions, but that just turns it into an anonymous function. So we can't, it's the same thing, but yeah, it's a small thing to be aware of. You cannot have named arrow functions. If you know of a way that you can do it, let me know. I don't think that's possible. But this means constructor functions can't be arrow functions because they're named. So if I try const person equals, how would I do it? How would I do this normally, right? As a reminder, done this plenty of times in this series. But if I create a person and then this dot name equals n, right? This would be a constructor function. I can say const me equals new person and pass my name Sina. Great. I mean, I can just console log me and it's of type person. So if I create another one function, let's do this again. If I, yeah, I mean, I can't have an arrow function. I can turn this into an anonymous function equals, oops, that, right? Okay, and then if I try to do this, it says person is not a constructor. So we'll circle back to this in a minute. Again, we'll see how to remedy the situation. Next is object methods. So finally, we have methods of an object, which are functions you add as properties of an object. So if I have const me equals new object, talk. This is normally how I would do this, right? I can say function and this was return hello. This is a conventional way of writing a method. If I do this, I can say me.talk. Perfect, no problem. But if I have you talk and have this be a arrow function, right? What happens here? You can say u.talk. Okay, fine. We're gonna come back to this example. There's a huge gotcha here. Trust me. As a reminder, if it's a one-line return statement, I can just say get rid of the return and get rid of the curlies. And oops, it's already been defined. I can do that, and then I can say u.talk hello. Okay, so not a big deal, but just keep this one in mind because this is the trickiest one of all. So that's how you write them. But now let's talk about what they're good for, and it comes down to two things. One is aesthetics, so how they look, really the look and feel of it, which is the argument usually for writing arrow functions is how small they are and how cute they are. Cool, so that's one thing. And the second is scope and how they change the meaning of this inside the function itself. So let's talk about aesthetics first. So the obvious benefit is that they are shorter. They are a little bit smaller, especially with the one-line return statement, which is kind of cool. A lot of examples you see online with arrow functions in different tutorials and different courses, they focus on small examples, small obvious cases where it's clearly nicer to write it as an arrow function. Say array.map, for example, with JavaScript becoming more functional, and you see this pattern a lot in React where you have a data array and you want to turn it into an array of DOM elements, for example. You can do something like this, right? That's pretty common. If you write React, this should look super familiar to you. You can convert this into an arrow function, right, without a return statement. So I'm all for that. This is nice. This is a less stuff to type, and it's a lot actually easier to read. But honestly, I find arrow functions harder to read in larger functions. So we have a function that takes over here an array like that, and based on some very simple condition, it's going to return one thing or another. This is inspired by Kyle Simpson's You Don't Know JS repo, or @Getify on Twitter. He's a JavaScript master. In case you don't know him, shout out to you, good sir. I've learned a lot from you over the years. But back to the code example, I don't know if I like this as an arrow function. It doesn't really look that nice to me. I mean, the fact that there's no function keyword and there's no curlies. And this isn't, by the way, a huge function, right? This is a very simple function with just a basic condition, but you already see how smaller functions lend themselves a lot better to arrow functions than larger ones. And this is just my personal preference, right? You can agree or disagree, whatever. So anyway, that's benefit number one, aesthetics. Benefit number two is a little more complicated, and that is around scope and how this keyword changes inside the function. You probably already know that anything to do with the this keyword is complicated, that's confusing. If a function doesn't use the this keyword inside it, you're probably fine. You can use arrow functions, convert it and go nuts, have fun, enjoy. However, if you are using this inside your function, which is a very fundamental part of JavaScript and functions and the reusability of functions, things are radically different in arrow functions. So there's a rule that all functions in JavaScript follow, and that is that they bind the value of this keyword to some object. In the last episode, episode 6, I talked about the this keyword for 20 freaking minutes. I tried to clarify the whole thing. You should definitely watch that if you haven't. You need to know how this works before you try to understand it in arrow functions. So I covered this keyword in every type of function in episode 6. So with the exception of arrow functions, obviously, which is what we're talking about now. Anyway, the dynamic nature of this keyword inside functions is one of the reasons why we have reusability of functions. It's one of the main mechanisms behind reusability in JavaScript and how we can pass functions around, and the value of this changes depending on the context it's running in. So the fact that this now changes is kind of a big deal. So let me try to explain. To the browser. Let's say I have a const me object and it has a name, Sina. It has a talk function, talk, okay. And what this does is it returns this. So it returns the entire me object. So you would think. And then I'm gonna actually add another one, arrow talk. And this one I'm gonna write as an arrow function. And it does the exact same thing as my talk function. It's gonna return this, right? Cool, so both of these functions rely pretty heavily on the this object. I mean, all they do is centered around the value of this. So depending on what this is, the function will do something completely different. So let's do that. If I do me.talk, what does it do? As expected, it's gonna return my object to me with the name prop and the two methods I added to it. So why is that? As a reminder, again, as I explained it in episode 6, that's because a regular function, when invoked by an object, automatically makes a binding between the this keyword and the object that called it. So whatever's on the left side of the function invocation. Again, just as a reminder, that's why I'm seeing the value of this change to the entire me, because me is the one that's calling talk. Great, but what's gonna happen when I do me.arrow talk, right? You've probably guessed it, things are gonna be different. It's not gonna be me anymore. And that is the gotcha around arrow functions. And that the binding of the this object just doesn't happen the way that it does in regular functions. And that is the first use case where we should not be using arrow functions, and that is inside objects as methods, especially if you use the this keyword inside the function. So just stick with regular functions and you'll be fine. So I'm gonna rewrite this and get rid of the arrow talk, boom. And by the way, thankfully we can actually, let me rewrite this, we can actually get rid of the function and the colon, so I can say me.talk, perfect, right? That's actually shorter than an arrow function anyway, so it's a nice little shorthand that we got, I believe, in ES6. So just do that, okay? So if this isn't bound to the object that's calling the function, what is it bound to? Well, it's bound to the surrounding scope where the function expression is. Wait, what? Isn't talk inside the me object? I mean, actually, let me rewrite it with the arrow function here. Boom, okay. Isn't the arrow function or the function expression inside the me object? Isn't that what this is supposed to be? Well, ask yourself, what would happen if you replaced your function with the this keyword? What would be the value of this outside the arrow function? It's going to be exactly the same thing on the inside that would be on the outside. So if I get rid of the arrow function here and type this, what are we gonna get, right? What is this? Well, it makes sense for someone who doesn't know how this works inside objects to say, well, this is referring to the me object, right? Actually, it's not. If I do this and say me dot, what is it, arrow talk, it's actually referring to the window object. And that's why the arrow, if I create an arrow function, I'm gonna actually rewrite this. If I bring back the arrow, this inside the function is going to be exactly what it would be outside the function. So if I didn't have the arrow function and I had the this keyword, that value, that object is exactly what you're gonna get inside the arrow function too. And that's why people hate JavaScript, unfortunately. Just because we're inside the me object in here doesn't mean that this equals the whole me object. This is still referring to the window object. Objects don't create a binding with this, functions do. That's why if we take a look at our previous example now, this should make sense, right? If I return this, now that you know this is not bound to the me object and this is bound to the window object, so of course if I do me.arrow talk, I'm gonna get the window object. So now you know that this is referring to the window object, the thing that would be the value of this outside the arrow function. So if I did this.name inside the function, so if I wanted to have some kind of, let's get rid of arrow, if I wanted to have some kind of meaningful this.name, for example, if I wanted to do that, me.talk what's it going to do? It's not going to give me anything because the window object does not have a name proper on it. So why is this useful? How can we use this to our advantage? Well, callback functions. For example, set timeout. I'm going to refresh here and do a set timeout. Actually, let me put this inside an object. So if I have a me object and have a name, same thing as before, I didn't have to delete it. So if I have a talk function in here, so this is a regular function, right? So far, no arrows. If I have a set timeout, right? And in the set timeout, I have another function. Let's write it as regular first, right? And say after 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, I want you to console log this.name, right? If I write this as an arrow function, actually we saw this in the previous episode, I think, but I didn't explain why. If I do me.talk, after 100 milliseconds, it's going to say my name. So why do we get me, right? Why is this equal to me? Again, ask yourself, what would be the value of this outside the arrow function? If you didn't have an arrow, what would be the value of this? I'm inside the regular talk function here. When I call me.talk, talk executes and it looks at the thing that's on the left side of it, and it binds the value of this to that object, which is the me object. So I can safely use this inside the arrow function and it doesn't change the binding of the this. Side note, don't use set timeout unless you really have to. People really abuse set timeout. They use it for really weird stuff. Don't do it. I'm just using it as an example here, right? So array.map is probably a better example, but hopefully you get the point. Water break. All right, what else should we not use arrow functions for? Well, functions added to a prototype. I covered this in episode 2, the prototype chain and whatnot. So if we have a constructor function, function person, and it takes a name and it does some stuff. This.name equals n. Okay. In episode 2, we saw that you can add methods to the prototype object. Person that prototype talk equals function. I can say that pretty easy, and it returns this. Okay. I'm going to add another one and call it arrow talk. And if I change this to an arrow function, okay, we're going to see something slightly different. You can probably guess where I'm going with this. So if I now create an object based on that, const equal me equals new person, okay, and I pass in my name, right? So me.talk is going to give me the person object. What is going to be the value of me.arrowTalk? Windows. So why is this happening? Well, the exact same reason as the object method. Again, ask yourself, what would happen if you replace your arrow function with this? What is the value of this inside the arrow function is the same thing that it would be on the outside. In other words, the arrow function does not create its own execution context. It just uses the this wherever it was created, wherever the arrow function itself was created, whatever surrounds it. So just to prove a point, I'm going to do another one, person. Let me clear this. I'm going to say person.prototype dot some other function, some other function equals this, right? And of course, me dot some other function is window, right? So if we take a look now at this guy, right? I create an arrow function. If you replace it with this, whatever value you get there is going to be the same thing on the inside. And that is why this is window. If you create an anonymous function that's an arrow function and attach it to a prototype. All right, what else? What else should I not be using arrow functions for? Well, constructor functions. We looked at it in the beginning, I already touched on it, but because we can't have a named arrow function, we can't use them as constructors either. Constructors by nature are named functions. So here's an example, const person equals, create an arrow function, right? I think I already showed you this. Doesn't matter what it does on the inside. If I do const me equals new person, person is not a constructor, right? So if it's an arrow function, it just refuses to do it. And then the fourth and the last place where you should not be using an arrow function is event handlers. What? I thought you said callback functions are good. Use them with set timeout. That's a callback function. I know. So this is the hardest one to explain because event handlers are callback functions. And earlier I specifically said that if you're using set timeout inside a method, you should use an arrow function. So why not with event handlers? Well, let's take a look. If I have a document.body.add event listener, let's add a click handler. Okay, let's say click, and I have a function. Apologies for the craziness typing inside a browser. If I do this, all right, and let's say console.log, what do I get with this? I have to open the window actually to click on it. Let's see, I'm gonna move it over here. So if I click, I get the body element, right? Click, click, click. Great, sounds good. Whereas if I turn it into an arrow function, let me write it one more time. I'll get rid of the function and I add the arrow. So what do I get now? I get window. So what's going on here? So what was our rule to finding out what this is inside the arrow function? It was to look at its surroundings. It was to see what is the value of this in the surrounding context. Usually when we add event listeners, we're in the global scope. And in the global scope, this is actually the window object. That's not the surprising part. The surprising part is that a regular function knows who the correct this is. That's the part that doesn't really make sense. I hope you're following me. How is that possible? Well, that's because of the way the browser calls your callback function, specifically inside setTimeout or inside an event listener. If you look inside the add event listener function itself, you'll see something interesting. It automatically binds this to the DOM element that you added your click handler to. We're getting into some unnecessary nuances of how browsers are actually implemented, the code inside the browsers. It just so happens that setTimeout doesn't create a binding with this because it has nothing to bind it to. Whereas an event listener has the ability to bind your callback function to the DOM element because that's what the event listener is attached to. To demonstrate this, actually, we can create our own. So let's create an example of how I can try and emulate one example of each. So let's say I have an outer function, and the outer function, all it does, it takes a callback. Whoopsie days. And it calls the callback. Right? Pretty simple. So that's my outer function. Then I can have an inner function, and my inner function console log this. Okay? So when I call the outer function and pass the inner function as an argument, as the callback, right? What do you think I'm gonna get? What do you think when inner gets executed? What is the value of this there? Window, because we didn't bind it to anything else, right? Whereas, I'm gonna write it again, but this time I'm going to take an object, and instead of just randomly calling the callback function, I'm gonna create some kind of binding with the object that hopefully later is gonna get passed into me. So I'm gonna say callback.call. I covered this in episode 6. If you don't know what this is, please go watch it. So instead of just calling the callback function, I'm gonna call it using the .call method and pass in the object, and that object becomes the value of this inside that function. So then the exact same inner function, which I will do console.log this. Now I'm gonna call my outer. Does outer have 2 T's? I don't know. I'm gonna call, and then I'm gonna pass an inner as a callback, and I'm gonna give it some object with the name Sina, and then Boom, the console log now is the object that I passed in. So the implementation inside the outer function, or the higher order function, perfect, really matters. So whether or not the value of this inside your inner function is going to be bound to some object or not, it very specifically depends on how the outer function is handling it. So hopefully that tells you why some callback functions should be arrow functions and some shouldn't. So as the fourth and the last place that you should not be using an arrow function, I'm gonna go ahead and add the event listeners. And with that, if you're not facing any of those four types of functions, four types of situations, and you prefer the syntax of arrow functions to regular functions, you can safely assume that it's going to be fine. You can go ahead and use them. This was probably the most information-dense video I have made in a long time. Let me know if I missed anything. I try to do my research before making these videos, but there's always a chance I missed something. Ask me your questions in the comments below. So I appreciate every comment. I appreciate you subscribing. Thank you. And if you're sharing the channel, I really appreciate it. This was episode 7 of the 10-part series I'm calling 10 Things JavaScript Developers Should Learn, should know, but probably don't. Next episode is higher order functions. It's gonna be interesting. I'm gonna touch on some of the higher order functions that I talked about today here. That would be episode 8. Thank you again for watching. See you next time. You're awesome.